In March of 1863, Congress passed an enrolling act for drafting Northern men into the Union Army. A man could avoid serving in the Army once drafted by either paying a commutation fee of $300 or substituting another man to serve in his stead. There was much anger, particularly among the urban poor who could hardly afford the $300 fee to avoid service, much less hire a substitute. There were cries of unfairness about a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. In New York in particular, violent anti-draft riots broke out. Between July 13th and 15th of 1863, a mob in New York City took its anger out on blacks. The rioters, who were mostly Irish, lynched people and burned the colored orphan asylum. There were shouts of "Kill the niggers." The violence continued to escalate, and other targets throughout the city were attacked. General Meade's troops came in and helped the New York militia and police suppress the violence. Order was restored. Over 100 people were killed and 300 people were wounded. New York Governor Horatio Seymour was neither friend nor ally of Lincoln. He was highly critical of the president. Early on in his administration, Seymour rebuffed Lincoln's entreaties for cooperation. He fanned the flames of protest against the draft, calling the draft unconstitutional and stating that no man could legally be forced to take part in the ungodly conflict which is distracting the land. After the riots, Governor Seymour sent Lincoln several letters in which he argued that New York's draft quotas were unfair and disproportionate. He also asked Lincoln to suspend the draft until courts had ruled on the constitutionality of the Enrollment Act. On August 7, 1863, Lincoln responded to Seymour's letter as follows: "I cannot consent to suspend the draft in New York, as you request, because, among other reasons, time is too important." As to Seymour's request that Lincoln suspend the draft until the courts had the opportunity to rule on the Enrollment Act's constitutionality, Lincoln said the following: "I do not object to abide a decision of the United States Supreme Court or of the judges thereof on the constitutionality of the draft law. In fact, I would be willing to facilitate the obtaining of it, but I cannot consent to lose the time while it is being obtained." In fact, this position was consistent with statements Lincoln had made to John Hay, his secretary, and others previously about his willingness to let the courts decide the constitutionality of the Enrollment Act. Lincoln continues in this letter to point out the strength of the Confederate Army. He says, "We are contending with an enemy who, as I understand, drives every able-bodied man he can reach into his ranks, very much as a butcher drives bullocks into a slaughter pen. No time is wasted, no argument is used. This produces an army which will soon turn upon our now victorious soldiers already in the field, if they shall not be sustained by recruits, as they should be." Lincoln continues to point out the practices of the Confederacy in building a large army. He says, "It produces an army with a rapidity not to be matched on our side, if we first waste time to re-experiment with the volunteer system, already deemed by Congress, and palpably, in fact, so far exhausted as to be inadequate." Lincoln then returns to Seymour's request that the draft be suspended until a court determines that the Enrollment Act is constitutional, stating, "And then more time to obtain a court decision as to whether a law is constitutional which requires a part of those not now in the service to go to the aid of those who are already in it, and still more time to determine with absolute certainty that we get those who are to go in the precisely legal proportion to those who are not to go." Lincoln then closes the letter to Seymour by stating, "My purpose is to be, in my action, just and constitutional, and yet practical, in performing the important duty with which I am charged of maintaining the unity and the free principles of our common country." In this last passage, Lincoln is subtly reminding Governor Seymour that New York is part of the Union, and it too must do its share to help the cause of the Union in this war. Governor Seymour was not mollified by this response. He wrote another letter in which he insisted that the draft in his state be altered as to the administration of quotas. Lincoln did reduce some quotas in New York districts. Seymour continued to be argumentative and resistant, and refused to cooperate with the administration in the institution of the draft in New York. For fear of more violence, Lincoln sent 10,000 troops to New York to maintain order while the draft was renewed there on August 19th. It is reported that only around 46,000 men were actually drafted during the Civil War. 59% of them paid the $300 commutation fee. The commutation provision continued to be a hot-button issue, but in fact, it was the hiring of substitutes that led to the great disparity in treatment between rich and poor in terms of who was drafted and who served. Congress eliminated the commutation provision in 1864, but it still allowed an individual to hire a substitute to serve in his stead. As Lincoln had predicted and warned, the cost of avoiding service in the Army became higher, making it difficult, if not impossible, for the middle class and the poor to dodge service in the Union Army.